And we're here for Letters in Arts today with Sharon Selby. Letters in Arts today is brought to you courtesy of the School of Language and Liberal Studies. And I just want to mention one thing before we get started. We're really excited that in March, on March 16th, we have First Nations writer Drew Hayden Taylor coming. I think it's a really big deal to have Drew Hayden Taylor here at Fanshawe. It's also a big deal to have today's guest, Sharon Selby, in a role. We see you every day, but this is a role we know you have, but we don't hear about every day. And to introduce Sharon, I'm going to ask, surprisingly, John to introduce.
Hi. Today's guest speaker is, in fact, my favorite author. I like her so much that I married her. This is a very complicated way of obtaining a free copy of her book. Had I known that the price point was going to drop to a very reasonable $10, our lives may have panned out differently. It's customary in an introduction like this to rattle off sort of the highlights of the author, the speaker's biography, but Sharon's life story is very much intertwined in her fiction, in her novel, and I know that this is something that she's going to talk about. So I will, without further ado, introduce Sharon Selby.
Thank you for coming, everybody. It's nice to have some familiar faces here. I guess I'll start by saying I often tell my classes when it comes time to do presentations that I sympathize with their reluctance to stand in front of an audience and talk, because even though I do it every day, the idea of doing a formal presentation kind of gives me the willies. So you'll have to bear with me and accept the fact that this is going to resemble one of these classes more than perhaps a typical author reading or author talk. I do have a copy of my book, but I'm not actually going to spend a lot of time reading it with it. So if you want to know what happens, you'll have to grab a copy of it. So I've got a list, so that I don't forget, of all the things I wanted to talk to you about today. The first thing is me, as John mentioned. My fiction and my academic writing and all the writing I do sort of ties in with a lot of aspects of my own life, which, as I say, it makes me think I might be an egomaniac or something like that. But there's a very clear parallel between my life stories and my fictional stories. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Another thing that I wanted to talk a bit about is the idea of memory and storytelling and the power of storytelling. And I'll get into this in more detail, but one of my favorite authors, Thomas King, tells us that the truth about stories is that that is all that we are. So as we walk through the world, the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell each other are the core of our identity, the key to our identity and our experiences and how we understand those experiences, and so how we are able to move through the world. I also want to talk about Shanakis, Celtic storytellers. If you hadn't come across the word Shanakis before, they're Gaelic storytellers for the ancient Scottish clans. And they had a really specific job, and I'll give you some highlights of that as we go. Is there anyone in here who writes or fancies, the creative process? Yeah, so I thought that it might be fun to talk a little bit about my experience with the writing process, and if you have comments or you want to share some of your experiences, please feel free to throw that out there. And finally, I thought I'd wrap up just talking a little bit about publishing and my experience with publishing, because I've done a bit of publishing in the traditional world with academic stuff, and I've done some independent publishing as well. So that's where we'll finish. So, the first thing I should tell you about me is that I'm from Manitoba. I grew up in a very small town, and when I say small, I mean super small, like 700 people small. You could probably fit 90% of our population in this room. And it's the kind of place where it takes 5 minutes to walk downtown to the store, But it takes you an hour to do so because you have to stop and say hi to every single person on the street because everybody knows you. It's also the kind of place when you're a teenager that's kind of a pain. Because if you get in trouble at school, your parents know about it before you even get home. So it's a really small, tight-knit community. But unexpectedly, it turned out to be a huge inspiration for me in my fictional and creative writing. I should also mention that despite the fact that I'm here and my job is to teach in a college, and I really love that job, and it's really exciting and fun. It surprises many of my teachers from high school and my undergraduate career that this is true. When I say that I was an unlikely academic, that's probably the grossest understatement of my entire presentation, possibly of my entire life. When I was in grade 2, for example, my grade 2 teacher apologized to my parents because I ruined Mother's Day because I refused to make one of those tea coasters with the correct pattern. I just put all the cool things on it. When I was in grade 6, I pretended I had a broken ankle so I wouldn't have to go to school for a week. Of course, nobody believed me. They told me I could just wrap myself up with a tensor bandage, so I limped for a week because I was that committed. When I was 15, I decided I was quitting school. I was done with high school, and I was going to be a waitress at the one restaurant at the gas station in my hometown. And I figured that, I could see a clear path to that. And my dad very wisely said, okay, finish this school year, you can get a job there in the summer, and if you like it, you're set. So I finished school, and I told everyone I was never coming back, and I went to work at the restaurant called 4C, and I was the worst waitress that they have ever seen in Manitoba. It turns out that I was so shy, I couldn't actually go up to the tables to take people's orders. And it never occurred to me that you could eat steak more than one way, or that there was any kind of dressing on salads except for ranch. So eventually, and by eventually I mean like after 3 days, I was demoted to the kitchen. And then eventually I decided that maybe high school wasn't so bad. And that kind of struggle with school followed me all the way through my university degree until I started doing my master's. And again, it's very strange in some ways to think of the path that brought me here. I went from, as I said, as a child, I didn't like school, but my teachers would bribe me to do my homework and my work by allowing me to write stories with my friend Erin, who's in the audience here, in grade 4, 5, 6. That's how I got through elementary school, was I was allowed to write stories in my free time. And then I had a science teacher that let me watch experiments even though I was in the O1 version of science. And so I got, some exposure, and I got to go on to university. And eventually I hit my master's. And then I kind of took off because I could just take nothing but English and literature because that was the thing that always appealed to me. So I did my master's. I got tired of being in school again, as one does after, 20 years. And so I decided I was going to go to the UK and teach high school. And that turned out to be really, really hard because London kids, especially in the comprehensive schools where I was teaching, are hooligans. At least the ones I was teaching were hooligans. And they told me when I got there that all the foreign teachers were teaching in the bottom sets, which means the lowest academically rated students. And I thought that was great because I like students that have character. I like students that aren't sort of cut from the mold, So I kind of thought that would be fun. But because I was trained in Canada and because I was trained to be compassionate and kind, they ate me alive, completely devoured me. I finally quit teaching in the UK because a student punched me in the face. Although it wasn't the punching in the face that made me quit. It was the headmaster's response of, well, you're foreign and a woman, so... So the point of this is, as I've had a chance to travel around, I went up to Edinburgh and studied Canadian Lit, because of course you go to Scotland to study Canadian literature. While I was doing this, I was taking notes, and I was noticing how people there think about us here. And I was experiencing culture shock, which takes a while to kick in when you're in a country that has the same language as you, more or less, right? It takes a while to start feeling all the differences. But while I was there, I started thinking about home in ways that I never had. So the idea of home and being homesick without really wanting to be, or being homesick without really knowing how to swallow your pride, maybe, enough to say, you know, that I don't want to stay overseas forever, although at the time I did want to stay overseas forever. It was kind of this conflict for me. So when I came to London, it was because I ran out of money. I couldn't afford my student visa anymore. I couldn't afford my rent anymore. By the time I came here, I had jobs doing things like, I'd been hired to write a memoir for family, for their crazy great-grandma. I had been hired to teach in an alternative school, and I was private tutoring. I was teaching at the university. I was trying to write my dissertation. I was trying to find an apartment that wasn't infested with mice. So it was all craziness, and I finally just gave up. And I mentioned Erin a few minutes ago, who I knew from my childhood. She's been working here for some time, and she always said, if you ever need a job, you should apply at Fanshawe, because it's a good place to work. So I did that with the intention of coming for maybe 4 months, maybe, you know, a year, making enough money so I could afford my visa and then go back. But then a few things happened. I met the guy who sat at the desk next to me and married him, and I discovered that I really liked it here. So that first year here was kind of hard, because part of me was still in Edinburgh, in Scotland. My head was still there. Part of me was still unwilling to accept that I missed Manitoba, and part of me was here and trying to come to grips with the fact that it's so different here. Again, culture shock, even though it's so much the same. There's little differences that, even the fact that I can't wear my mucklucks most of the time because it doesn't get cold enough in the winter, right? So it's all these little things that I was wrestling with, and that's where I started writing. I was writing my dissertation. I was finishing my dissertation on storytelling and memory and narrative and identity and all of those things. And I started writing stories that tied those things together. It was a way of processing the work that I was doing academically and my own personal struggles. So what I ended up with is this mishmash of fantasy and sort of down-home Canada and Scotland and mythology and all kinds of different things that came together in this story. So I started out telling you a little bit about my hometown and how small it is. When I was 18 years old, I couldn't wait to move. I went to Winnipeg the day after I had my graduation, practically, and I never looked back. I was so excited, finally, out of that town, into the city. And so, you know, it's still funny to me that it was home, Manitou, that I wrote. And that picture up there of Manitou is Manitou. That's not my neighborhood. That's not my street. That's the town. There's literally 8 streets. And it's a fantastic place when you're a child. You can bicycle all over the place and everybody knows you, and as long as you're not getting into trouble, it's fun. But it's, you know, it was interesting to move. So my story is grounded in Manitou. It starts just outside of Winnipeg. And all the places that I write about are real. Manitou's real, obviously. Winnipeg, there was a house that my main character lives in that belonged to friends of mine that lived in St. Norbert. The house in Manitou that the 3 Fates are living in is a house that doesn't exist anymore. But when I was a child, I lived next door to it. And so it was this house, an old lady and an old man lived in there, and they probably weren't even that old, now that I think about it. But they lived in this house, and it was this yellow, tiny house with a garden, and it was so mysterious and interesting. And then there's Pelican Lake and the Sanatorium, because of course part of my story has to take place in a sanatorium, where people with mental health issues are staying, and it's real too. And so I grounded it in the reality and then brought my elements of fantasy into that. And of course there's tons of inside jokes in there whenever I write about Manitou. So I can't go to our restaurant in town anymore unless I order a burger, because I talked about burgers in my story. There's a little throwaway line about a guy driving down the street with curtains in the back of his truck, and we all know who that guy is if you're from Manitou, or just little things like that. And I draw people that I know into it. My dad is the lawyer, Mr. Selby, is the lawyer that my main character goes to see. And so, like I said, this was my way of trying to reconcile all of these places that I wanted to think of as home and what I actually thought of as home. And bringing, it's sort of a love letter in some ways in the end to all the places that I've been. So, yeah. So I thought I'd show a few pictures of the sanatorium. It was a tuberculosis sanatorium back at the beginning of the 1900s, the 20th century. And everybody is familiar with line drawings, right? Where you kind of you draw a few lines and it gives you the impression, or sort of inspires the understanding of whatever it is you're drawing, if it's a horse or whatever. I try to use that in my writing. I like to use a few lines. I'm not James Michener. I don't write 400 pages of description about a single seashell, right? I like the bigger strokes. And as a consequence, a number of people that actually had worked at the sanatorium came and told me that they thought it was really cool because they could see it, they knew it. And I finally saw this place in the summer for the first time. And it was so cool because in my story, you kind of drive down this alley of trees and then it kind of appears. And that's what it was like. Of course, every place is like that, right? But it was there, and that's the way it worked out. So it was just, cool for me to do that. So again, back to this idea of the truth about stories. All I'm going to be doing this whole time is probably stringing together stories about stuff that happened. But those are the things that make us who we are. Those are the things that are the cornerstones of our identity. We endlessly narrate, as I said at the beginning, for ourselves and for each other, the events of our lives. That's where our identity comes in. Even if you never write a single word about your life, you walk around with your own autobiographical narrative. Memory is narrative, and that's how we know who we are from one year to the next. If you think about how, who you were when you were 6, or who you were when you were 14, and who you are today, right? Those people maybe have some things in common. They're walking around in the same meat suit, but the differences are huge. So it's our story that creates that continuity between all the crazy things that happen to us in our lives. What am I saying? Right. So, and the interesting thing about our stories is that we have to tell them, and because we have to understand them, even if we're only telling them to ourselves. And we can become so immersed in our memories and our storytelling that sometimes we don't even notice what's going on around us, and we seem to re-experience them in really happy times. You can re-experience your wedding. You can re-experience a day when something really awesome and amazing happened. In less wonderful times, we can re-experience trauma, right? Experiences that were hard or bad can reoccur to you again and again. And if you can't tell that story, if you can't assimilate that story into your experiences, then you can't get past it. Because it's not events themselves that are traumatic. Right? It's not the time that you got hit by a car that was traumatic. It's your inability to get past it. It's the fact that it's the way that memory intrudes on your daily experiences, or every time you step out into the street. It's not that you were hit once. It's that every time you step on the street, you're hit by a car. Does that make sense? So it's the lack of articulation, the lack of assimilation that makes trauma so painful and makes it so real and present. So that's trauma memories, and I'll talk more about that because it's something I'm really interested in. Those are the kinds of memories that if you don't learn how to tell the story, they don't change, because the rest of our stories evolve, right? If you think back about the time you were, 15 and the person you liked was ignoring you, and then you find out later that it wasn't because you were a loser like you thought, it's because they liked you too but didn't know how to act on it. So suddenly you have more information, that story changes, right? Or sometimes really embarrassing things become funny when you get older. I don't know about you, but my sisters and I and my brother will sit around and tell embarrassing stories all the time, and we'll laugh our faces off, despite the fact that when it actually happened, except for my sister Liz, because she's got a weird sense of humor. But the rest of us, at the time, you might not have been able to laugh at it, but later, you can, you find that release, you find that way to see the absurdity or the humor. So, as we become more mature, as we gain more information, the stories that we have about ourselves and our memories evolve. And that's really important, because the way we function in the present is the result of what's happened to us in the past. And the way we envision our future is a result of what has happened in the past, what's happening now. But the way we look back on our past is influenced by where we are right now. So time isn't linear for us, even though we think it is. It's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. And memory is at the core of that, and the fact that we can't get through the day without relying on our memories. And again, that was something that was really interesting and really important to me when I was doing my studies, and so it became really important in my writing. The other thing that I think is really interesting about memories is that we appropriate memories and stories from each other all the time. Not in a negative way, but a huge, ridiculous amount of our memories aren't our memories. They're photographs, or they're stories that we've been told about ourselves, or they're stories that we've heard and liked and just made our own over time. And I think of, there was one time when I was flying back from Scotland, and I got to Toronto, and I was on my way to fly to Winnipeg, and I sat down in my chair beside this lady who was eating a giant Subway sandwich. And she started eating it, she unwrapped it, she's like, literally like this crazy, I think she hadn't eaten for a week, and stuff was flying everywhere. And finally this piece of ham lands on my shoe, and I looked at my shoe, and I looked at her, and I was kind of shocked, and she's like, it's just ham. And so I tell this story at home, and my family likes this story so much that every single person tells it, and most of them tell it better than me. And it's a running joke in our family now. It's just ham, or it's just whatever, right? So it becomes this family story that everybody, and my sister Liz always says, I love that story, I feel like I was there. And so some of our stories are actually like that. We think that they happened to us, but they didn't. We've just heard them so many times that we've become convinced that that was our story. Because memory is tricky, right? Like I said, it evolves, it changes, it gets blurry. So that's why smart people write everything down.
So one way you're telling us we're crazy.
Yeah.
No,
Well, I mean, but it's kind of true, but in a good way. Right? Crazy in a good way. We're kind of magnets for stories. And we're hardwired in our psyche for stories. So we pick them up and we're characters in our own narratives. And if we want to be the hero of that story, we can be. If we want to be the bad guy or the victim or whatever, we get to choose who we are in our own stories. And we attract the stories to us that reinforce those ideas and beliefs. So just a couple of interesting things about storytelling is that when you tell stories, you learn better. We remember things better if people tell us stuff in the form of stories. And stories are really handy for teaching empathy and compassion, If you can put yourself in someone else's position or situation, it makes it a lot easier to identify with them and to sympathize with their feelings and their experiences. On a scientific level, apparently storytelling changes your brain function. If I was just standing here reading off my PowerPoints and you were just reading it, different centers, language centers and things like that in your brain would be lighting up. But when I tell you stories, or when you tell me stories, or when you tell each other stories, our brains get into sync. And the same parts of my brain that are lighting up, light up in your brain. And so you picture things the way that I picture them. And you have that experience of shock and horror when that woman's hand lands on your foot. And you might remember that story longer than you'll remember, the statistics about how many people live in Manitou or something like that, right? So it changes, and it creates a mirror, a sympathy, a connection between the teller and the listener. And I find that really fascinating. And again, this is something that came into my incredible creative liberties with the Gallic Shanakis. I had never heard of Shanakis until I was reading Alistair MacLeod's No Great Mischief. And there's one line that refers to the Shanakis in the entire novel. But for some reason, that one line, more than any other line in the entire book, stayed with me and struck me. And the line reads, "And if the older singers of the Clan Clan Rua," any Gaelic speakers forgive me, that was horrific. Clan Clan Rua, the Shanakis, as they were called, happened to be present, they would remember events from a Scotland which they'd never seen, or seen our futures in the shadows of the flickering flames. And that image stayed with me when the rest of the novel completely left me behind. And that idea of storytellers who could remember events that they'd never seen, or who could read the future just by watching the pattern of the flame. For some reason, that really got me thinking. And of course, part of it too is that my memory is dodgy. So I always remember this as Shanakis who can remember the future. And that comes from somewhere else completely. But that's what I always have in my mind when I think of it. They remember the events of the past that they've never seen. They can remember a future that hasn't happened yet. And so when I started writing about Shanakis, I took that little gem and turned it into something a little bit larger than life. As I said at the very beginning, my writing tends to pull my life and realism into a more fantastical narrative or under symbols and underpinnings. And one of the things that I got thinking about is if you can get so caught up in a story. Have you ever had that experience when you're reading something or talking to someone or watching a movie or TV, and all kinds of things can be happening around you and you have no idea because you're just that absorbed in what you're doing? That experience is kind of fascinating to me. And those of you that write probably have had the experience where you start writing and you're doing stuff and something interrupts you and you kind of stagger around for a few minutes trying to get back into real life for a bit. And that's my idea for the Shanakis. It comes from this idea that it's not really magic. In my book, I said, it turns out being a Shanaki isn't really magic. It's the kind of thing people do all the time when they get caught up in a story and lose track of time, or when they remember something so strongly they can smell it, or taste it, or see it. The truth is, people are always skirting the edges of what Shanakis can do. Shanakis just do it more, they go further. And because we humans put so much stock in our stories, Shanakis end up with a lot of power. So this idea that it's not really magic, anybody could be a Shanaki. You just need to have that focus. You just need to have that, that ability to really tell a story. And not just tell a story, but step into it. And that's where the magic in my narrative comes from. The Shanakis are able to step from this world into the other world, the world of stories, or the world of memory. and the stories that they tell themselves, the stories that they create themselves. And that's, in some ways that can be a great blessing. It can be a great gift to be able to step into your favorite story or to step into your favorite memory. But of course, the conflict in my story is that it can also be a trap. It's a dangerous thing to let your favorite story or your favorite memory dominate your life in the present. If you get so caught up in looking back, you can't move forward. And sometimes when we face hard times or calamities or bad things happen, that's the temptation, to always be looking back, to always be trying to find that time when things are better. But one of the things the characters need to learn in my story is that calamity can also be an occasion for change. It creates the space for change to happen. So if you can look at calamity, if you can tell that story, then you can move forward. And you can find the space to reinvent yourself, or find the space to reinvent the parts of your life that aren't working anymore. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. So, in my story, like I said, there's the danger of stories becoming a trap. My character's mother gets trapped in a memory that just circles over and over and over again. She can't bear to look at reality. She can't bear to face what she's lost. And it takes, she has to be saved. She has to be rescued by someone that means something to her in the present. Someone who can pull her back into real life. I'm working on a second story, and that's where I'm starting from. And how do you do that? What happens if you finally realize, okay, this happened. I've told my story, now how do I get past it? How do I stop telling that same story? So stories can be a gift. Stories and memories can be a trap. And one of the things I like to write about is the idea of a glamour. The bad guys in my story have the ability to create glamours or to create false stories that can be misleading. But once you can see through that, those memories decay. So again, you can see how artificial those stories are. And that's part of seeing through the glamour of the past, or seeing through the glamour of the stories that we sometimes allow to ensnare us. If you've ever been dumped by someone that you keep up on a pedestal, the day that you start to realize that actually they're not that good, right? They weren't that good for me. They weren't everything I thought they were. Those memories start to decay. The glamour starts to fade. And then you can see them as they are. And then you can feel better, about being where you are now, instead of, always pining for that moment that you lost. So one of the things, as well as a town and people, I also was given a gift once of tarot cards, Celtic tarot cards. And so they're really cool. But in my story, they keep them, and they have this deck, this very deck, wrapped in this very scarf. But they have them, and they use them as a focusing point. Something that I found really interesting is that, in the past, in different civilizations and cultures, people would look into, you look at the patterns of the flights of birds, or you look at the way birds' innards scatter when you open them, or you find different ways of finding a pattern and telling the future. And I've always thought that was really interesting. And for me, the cards in my story action as a focal point. They inspire stories. It's not that they're prophetic or magic, or that in some way, these cards would tell, one character something that they wouldn't tell another. It's all about that focus, and it's all about how you look at it and drawing on that magic. So that's one other thing that I like to think about is the way that we find meaning, we find patterns in all kinds of things. It doesn't have to be a deck of cards. If you've got your favorite Batman and Spider-Man, and that tells you something, right? That means something. And they tell you a story. Exactly like those guys. So we find our meaning, we find our stories in the things around us. We don't just build them in a vacuum. So the last thing, I'm running out of time. The last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is I start my story in a moment of crisis for my character. And the first line in the book is, life can change in the space between one breath and the next. Sometimes you don't even know it's happened. The day my life changed, I had no idea that it was anything other than a perfectly ordinary day. In fact, it was a perfectly ordinary day, right up until the moment when suddenly it wasn't. And again, this speaks to how we go through our lives with our stories and we think we're doing one thing and a whole bunch of other stuff can be happening. And again, there's that moment of shock when what we think is happening and what is really happening collide. And so for Skye, who receives news that her parents have just been in a horrible accident and their bodies have been, they're disappeared. And, so the start of the story is her trying to come to grips with this experience. And when I talk about it in the story, I describe how time slows down. I describe how she feels this story in her body, right? She feels this news. She can feel the energy draining out of her arms. She can feel sort of the blood draining from her head. She can feel, how stunned and confused. And she can feel how dry her mouth is and that trickle of sweat down her back. And just describing it takes me back into that story because that's how I react to moments of crisis. I get that feeling where I start getting weak, the weak feeling in your arms. And just, like I said, just talking about it brings me back to that. And our stories, therefore, aren't just intellectual. They're in our bodies as well. They're in the scars, they're in the bruises, they're in the, all of the things that make us us, right? They're in the jeans that don't fit, or that do fit, or they're in all of us. So part of how we remember is because we can feel these stories, and part of how we remember affects how we feel in our bodies, right? So everybody knows when you're feeling super stressed out, you walk around and you're all tense and scrunched up, right? That's terrible, right? So we carry that stress, we carry those stories with us in our bodies. And again, back to this idea of being able to tell a story and letting it go. It's not just an intellectual exercise, it's actually a physical experience. So I start out the first half of the novel talking about Skye on her own, my character Skye on her own, in her own words. It's a first-person narrative. The second half of the story shifts because I wanted to have the reader see her from the outside. Because she's not a perfect character. She doesn't always understand what's going on around her. She doesn't always tell the truth exactly. It's not that she lies. She just doesn't always recognize what's happening. She misinterprets things. And she tries to leave stuff out. So as soon as you get to the second part and you start seeing her through other people's eyes, you realize, oh yeah, she tries to sound like she's got it all together in the first half, but she doesn't. So the story that she's telling herself and telling us doesn't always jive with the story that we get in the second part. Again, for me, it was kind of fun just to be able to do that shift in perspective. Because again, it made me think, in my own experience, how often perhaps I walk around thinking, oh, I'm being really stoic and I've got a good face on things and nobody has any idea. And then it turns out everybody knows exactly what's going on. But the best kept secrets are the ones everyone knows and nobody talks about. And if people can see you're struggling and trying not to talk about it, I mean, that's the kind of thing that people can stay away from the subject then. So how we think things are happening, we sometimes think, oh, nobody cares. But it's just maybe nobody knows how to talk about it. So it was interesting to me, again, to take this one character, get right inside her, in her character, and then to shift to her on the outside. Am I out of time? Okay. Cool. So, a couple minutes? Sure. 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay, thank you. So the last thing I want to talk about is just the writing process. The writing process is hard. That's the first thing. If you write, you should do it all the time if you can. Random notes, write things on your hands or write them on pieces of paper. But be relentless. Write every single day if you possibly can. The second thing you should probably do is establish a routine. Because if you don't have a routine that you preserve all the time, then it's really easy to say, well, I'll just write twice as much tomorrow. Or I'm not gonna, I don't have time today. It's not that important. But it is that important. For me, and this sucks, my best writing time is around 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. I used to be a real night owl. I love staying up late. But I can't do it anymore because I can't write at that time. My best times. I got up at 4 o'clock this morning to try to think about what I was going to say today, partly because I was nervous and so I procrastinated, but also because that's when that's when I think. That's when my brain, things start to click a bit better. So establish that routine, and even if it stinks, stick to it. I think was it J.D. Salinger or someone like that? Used to write in his car because that was the only time he could get any peace and quiet. He'd sit out in his driveway in the car. Maybe not, he was a hermit, so maybe it wasn't J.D. Salinger, but someone like in that era used to sit in their car and write to get away from the noise and the people. Another thing I highly recommend, in addition to setting up your routine, is set a reasonable goal. My goal is 1 sentence. And that doesn't sound like much, but if you take the time at 6 in the morning to write 1 sentence, you'll usually write a few more sentences. And if you're having a day where it's like, oh my God, I can't be bothered, that 1 sentence is still better than nothing. And over the course of 30 days, you've got 30 sentences, if nothing else. And that really helps because writing is hard. And part of what makes it hard is things like writer's block. Right? Has everybody experienced writer's block, even if you're just working on an essay, when nothing will come? When that happens, what's that?
All the time.
Right. So there's 2 ways to deal with writer's. Well, there's probably a million ways to deal with writer's block, but the most easy, obvious ones are to write through it, even if it sucks, even if what you write is terrible. It's better to have bad words than no words. Right. So it's a lot better just to make sure that you're still fighting through it. Now, there's a careful balance between inspiration and sort of dogged persistence, right? And all of us like those moments when inspiration comes. And all of us love those moments when you write yourself into a corner and you go to bed because you're like, oh my God, I'm never going to figure this out. I have no idea what happens next. And then you wake up in the morning at 6 o'clock because that's your writing time, and suddenly you realize, oh yeah, of course. I know exactly what happens next, right? So there's a fine line sometimes between writing through the block and giving yourself a bit of breathing space. But the trouble with writer's block is that sometimes we just give it up entirely. So if you're blocked, at least try. Write a few sentences, jot down some ideas, anything. Just don't give up your routine. And having a plan is important, but don't get trapped by it. My book ended in a way that I never expected. I thought I knew it was going, and then it didn't. It went somewhere else entirely. And that's the oldest cliche in the book. And writers, oh yes, my characters were talking to me. They just kind of wrote themselves. But it's true in some ways, right? Stories have a way of getting their own life and having their own continuity and their own internal consistency and coherence. And it's really important that you allow your stories to breathe. So don't get so caught up in an outline, unless you're, John Grisham or someone who has like 20 contracts a year, and you have to follow your formula in order to get it done by the deadlines. So inspiration's important, but you have to chase it. Having a plan is good, but you don't want to be trapped by it. Routines suck, but they're also essential. And that's because you have to have a draft. Right? You have to get to that point where you have enough words on the paper to start revising. And revising is when the fun starts. Your first draft and your last draft often have very little in common with each other. Right? What you think is going to happen, or the characters, they evolve, you change them, someone reads it and says, oh, that was dumb. Or that, for me, it was, Fran would never say that. Right? So that sounds more like Amy. So, you know, I had to rejig some things. But, you know, you have to be ruthless with yourself. One of the biggest traps that writers can fall into is that moment where you think, oh my God, this is the best sentence I've ever written in my entire life. It is hilarious and witty, and you go back and you read it and you're like, well, I don't know if it really belongs there, but I really, really love it. Or, oh my God, if I cut that out, then I've got to write a whole new 500 words or whatever it is. Be ruthless with yourself. Put it in a little file, print it out and pin it to your wall so that you can admire it. Send it to all your friends so they can see how cool you are. But be ruthless when it comes to the editing. It's much better to torture yourself and get that stuff out before someone else reads it and goes, ugh, that's weird. They kind of lost the plot, you know, when that happened. Or an editor who comes along and, you know, just cuts it out ruthlessly for you without even giving it a fond farewell, right? So take the time to be ruthless. Grow a thick skin. Ask for criticism. Again, and tell everyone who reads it, you know, as you're writing, as you're drafting, don't sugarcoat it. Because again, what you don't want is for everyone to say, oh, I love it, it's the best book I've ever read, and then have an editor say, yeah, sorry, that's not publishable, right? So you want people to be honest. So criticism is the way you grow, and it's the way you develop as an author. But you don't have to take it personally. Just because you wrote a stupid sentence doesn't mean that you're stupid. Or just because you have a sucky, you know, moment doesn't mean that your whole story stinks. It's just a matter of, you know, recognizing how to separate the good stuff from the less good stuff. And it's hard not to take it personally sometimes, but the sooner you develop that thick skin and that ability to take criticism, the faster you're going to develop as an author. So you should welcome that stuff. Even negative reviews and feedback. It's hard to believe, but every once in a while I get a review on Amazon that I don't like. And I have to take that into consideration. It's not that I have to forget, you know, hate my story, because my story's me. It's you know, all the things I love and care about. But I can, when I'm writing my next book, think about, oh, you know, do I actually believe what that person said? Is that valuable criticism? Is it something good to have in the back of my mind so that I can, you know, consciously avoid making those kinds of whatever? Does that kind of make sense? And the last thing is to remember that it's a process. Just because you've got to the end of your first draft doesn't mean that it's done. Unfortunately, I wish that it did. But if you get to the end of that first draft, give yourself a high five, because I have one novel that I finished. It's the one sitting right there. I have probably 20, you know, incomplete stories that have 100 pages, but then I just run out of steam, or I didn't have a routine, or I hit writer's block and I didn't soldier through, or you know, whatever. I just didn't finish them. So I finally had one story that I really, really wanted to tell, and I did all the things I could to tell that story. So finishing is the hard part. You know, writing is fun, writing is, you know, infuriating, it's all of these things, but it's finishing that separates someone who loves to write from someone who gets to say that they're a writer. So finish. Whatever you do, even if you don't like the way it finishes, even if you think, oh crap, you know, I need about 2 chapters, but I only have 50 words to explain something that happened, just power through. Get to the end. You can develop things later, but finish. Right? That's the thing. That's the aim. Anyone could write a book, right? Everybody always says that, oh, I could write a book if I wanted to. And anyone can start one. Anyone can be a brilliant writer. Anyone can have brilliant ideas. What I learned was that you gotta finish it. That's the thing. That's the hardest. That's the part that makes you be the writer. So once you finish, you have options. How you're going to publish it, how you're going to present it to the world. Okay. So you can independently publish, or you can go with traditional publishing. Just to wrap up. Amazon has a really cool program where you can post your books. People can buy them in ebook form. You can get a deal through Amazon with CreateSpace, and it's awesome. If you are disciplined and edit and don't do what I did, which is race to the finish line and then decide, oh, whoops, I made some mistakes. Now I need to put out a new edition, which means there's like, copies of the first one out there. And then realize, oops, I had another mistake in that second version. So there's like 1,000 versions of my book because I was so impatient. And then my academic publishing has all been traditional, which is, it involves query letters and things like that. It's respectable in the sense that indie publishing sometimes has a bad name attached to it, but it's worth investigating both. And independent publishing is becoming more and more possible. And we're out of time, so if you want to talk to me about this, I've got nowhere to go, so that's it.
Well, one more tip for the writing.
Yeah.
Avoid grading memos and letters.
I got that covered. Good.